Hi, and welcome to Disciple Bible Study. My name's Kip McClurg, and I'm one of the pastors at Vestavia Hills United Methodist Church. This is our new attempt to help small groups learn digitally and to learn virtually. This video has been designed for use with Zoom or WebEx, but we also encourage you to know that Disciple Bible has a long history in Methodism, and the study guide, leader's guide, and DVDs that are put out by Cokesbury are also excellent resources. What we're using really is a supplement to this, but if the real learning is from the reading of Scripture and from the ideas that come from the study guide. And so we encourage you to get a copy of those and use those. Those are used on a daily basis as a part of Disciple. But we're hoping that this teaching tool will help us all learn things a little bit easier in a little bit different format that helps us as we do things virtually. So I say welcome, and I'm looking forward to being with you the next few weeks. Well, welcome to this session of Disciple Bible. We continue our way through Genesis and Exodus, and today we're looking at lesson number 10 in the Ten Commandments. We grew up learning the Ten Commandments as children, and we could memorize, especially the shorter ones. Those were the easiest, and the longer ones were harder. And then there were some that had words we didn't really know what they meant. But the Ten Commandments are the most critical piece, or one of the most critical pieces, of the early life of Israel, for it gave them the structure for how they were to live. And the 10 have a particular order, and the first two that come are first and second for a reason. You start with what's called the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength. God is one. There is only one God. You can't have sub-gods. You can't have multiple gods. There's one God, and you have to love that one God with everything you have. This is the cornerstone. It is what makes Christianity and Judaism monotheistic. There's only one God. And they lived in a culture where there were multiple gods. Every city, every temple had its own god, and it would then often have an idol with it. So the second of the commandments says, don't make a graven image, or don't make an idol or carved image of a god. And all the way through Scripture, God never allows for an image to be made. Even when Moses wants to see him so that he can have that image, God refuses to be shown of his face, it would say. And so this is very important, and you want to establish up front, and God want to establish up front, that God's in charge. All of the other idols really have no meaning and aren't really powerful, have no power. And the other gods are categorically eliminated, which did make it difficult for the early Christians and who were under rule. You see, as I said, every little town, every city would have its own god. And so in early Christian culture, if you went to Ephesus, you would have to go to and worship and pay homage to the goddess that was at Ephesus, or if you went to a different city. But categorically, Christians said, no, there's only one God, and you can't do that. It was believed that by sort of appeasing these gods, you helped the culture out, and they would smile on you and bring prosperity to a city. And so often early Christians were persecuted because they followed the first commandment. Now, it's important that we always get our idea of who's in charge clear first. If you've ever taught a classroom, or if you've been in a court, you want to establish early on, the first day of class, early in the court, that the judge is in charge, that the teacher is in charge. These are the rules. These are how we're going to treat each other. And so the very first commandment was set so that the children of Israel had no doubt who was in charge. They had no doubt what the culture was going to be. There wasn't a way to try to wiggle around what God's environment that God was wanting to create in Israel, what that would be like. If you don't establish that from the get-go, you know that a classroom can fall apart. A city that's that's not governed well, and there's not clarity on the rules, and trust with the person in charge can kind of devolve, as can a country or a church or any organization. And so with Israel, they were theocracy, and it was very important that they understood from the very beginning that God was in control. There was no other gods, and everything else would come from those two commandments. And now let's pause together and answer some questions about these first two commandments together. So the next commandments begin to deal with what it's like to live in life, and what are some things that need to happen for life to happen and to be lived out effectively and with love. And so the third commandment deals with oaths, to not use God's name in vain, as we would say. And that means to claim the name of God for any human enterprise or to give human advantage to what you're doing. Now, when I grew up, it was that you weren't supposed to cuss. That's what it means to not use God's name in vain. And certainly, that's using God's name flippantly and without respect, and that is a piece of the commandment. But the commandment goes much deeper than that. For you see, when we say something or we use God as an image or as a sort of giving God's approval to us, we're taking a pretty big step. And so when I see a politician or when I see a business that claims the name of God or says that they are Christian or they use Christian symbols in their advertising, that begins to encroach actually on what this commandment is about. We don't use God's name in vain. God's name is to be reserved. It's hijacking God's authority for something that God would not approve of. How many wars, how many battles, how many decisions have been made using God's name as a justification and God's approval as justification for what were really human choices? And so Scripture tells us we don't need to go there. Another place that this comes in to being is that if we claim to be a follower of God, but we don't live up to that name, we say, I'm a Christian, but our life doesn't reflect that, then we're borrowing God's authority, but we're not living up to it. And so we're really using God's name in vain. Devout Jewish persons would not speak the name of God. They would never say it. And the people who would even write it in Scripture would only write the abbreviation of God's name, and they would wipe their pens before the abbreviation. They had great respect for God's name. They would never use it in a way that was, well, they would never use it, but they would certainly not use it in a way that was adverse to who God is. Now, the next commandment involves the Sabbath. And the Sabbath is this idea that from the beginning of creation, God worked for 6 days, and on the seventh day, there was rest. There is this rhythm of working hard and then resting. No human being can work forever, and we've all been in those places. But that Sabbath principle really applies much more broadly than just simply our weekends off. It is built into the bigger picture. If you're a professor, you have the opportunity to take a sabbatical, which comes from the word Sabbath or Sabbat. And so every 7 years, you need a break from the normal teaching so that you can sort of get inspired to teach some more and perhaps to write some more and do a different type of research. In the Old Testament, it was important that you not work people to death. And so if you remember the story of manna, there was manna did not come down on Sabbath, but there was enough for them for that one day. But that was the only day you could store up. And then you had to let Sabbath happen on the fields. We learned this the hard way with what we call crop rotation. If you don't rest the fields upon occasion, their nutrient value starts to diminish and diminish and diminish. Farm animals need to have time to recover. And servants, your employees, people who work for you, they deserve legitimate time to catch up and to have a vacation. The Sabbath concept was part of the law of Israel. You lived it. It was also a reminder that we're a part of something bigger, that we're part of the created order, just as we are not divine, we are part of the creation. We live by creation's rules, and as such, we need a moment to to allow ourselves to relax and to calm down and to reconnect with the Creator God. And Sabbath was designed with that idea in mind. Sabbath is also a reminder that being is more important than doing. It's a waste of time. I mean, you take a day out and you rest, and there's so much more that you could do. And our culture certainly is one that keeps trying to do more and more and more all the time. But if we're followers of God and we understand that we're part of creation, there's this reminder from Sabbath that what we do is not nearly as important as who we are. We are children of God, and God values us not for our productivity, but God values us because we are God's children. And so Sabbath is a reminder to us that it's not our productivity, our doing, but it is our being that matters the most. Along with worship, if you mostly work with your mind, and this is a tip that I learned early in life. If you work mostly with your mind, on Sabbath, you rest by using your body. So if you're a person who sits in an office all day, and certainly Sabbath hopefully involves worship, but it's also important that you use a different part of your body. So if you're often thinking with your mind, then Sabbath would mean that maybe you could use your body and enjoy exercise or be outside or find a way to get out and enjoy the world. But if you mostly use your body all week and you're tired physically, then Sabbath can be a time to exercise your mind and use it in a way that hasn't been used before. So there's a lot of opportunity at Sabbath to take a break from the normal rhythm of life that can sort of, well, it can become a grind that grinds us down. Now, the fifth commandment is for us to honor your father and your mother. Now, we learn that as children that we're supposed to obey our parents, and that works out pretty good until we hit teenage years. And then we start getting a lot of questions, and really we kind of know down deep that we're supposed to obey our parents, even as teenagers. But as we become adults, what does it mean to honor one's father and one's mother? Well, it means that we're essentially to take care of them. And even if we don't have the best relationship with them, even if they're difficult to deal with, we still have a responsibility under the commandment, and the people of Israel did, to care for parents. And if you know the story of Noah, and remember that Ham was cursed, and Ham was the oldest child, one theory of why Ham was cursed was that Noah was getting older, he wasn't paying attention, he was walking around without clothes on, and rather than really taking responsibility, Ham continued to allow his father to do things that in his normal mind he probably would have been very embarrassed about. And so it's a reminder for us that we're to honor our parents, we're to take care of them, we're to make sure that they don't put themselves in situations that would embarrass them or be harmful to them. The commandment also is a reminder that we're to model to our kids how we hope that they will one day treat us. We were blessed to be able to take care of my mother for a number of years, and mother had some severe mental struggles. And to some extent it was sad for us because our children were very embarrassed to invite their friends over when they were teenagers. And while they were teenagers, that sort of broke my heart. But now that they're older, they look back and they realize the importance of what it means to be a loving and honoring child. And I hope one day that they'll take care of me as I did with my mom. But there's a certain amount of modeling that we're called upon to do. We're called upon to acknowledge the esteem and wisdom of our parents. It doesn't mean we have to agree with them. It doesn't mean that we can't see them for their faults that they are going to have. But we still have a measure of honor and esteem. It's interesting that one of the last things that Jesus does before he dies on the cross is to make sure that Mary, his mother, is cared for. So even at the point of death, Jesus believed in the fifth commandment, and he made sure that he honored his mother that day. Well, let's pause for a few minutes and talk about these ideas and questions. So our sixth commandment is one that's always easy to memorize when you're in Bible school. Do not kill. Uh, Strictly speaking, it refers to taking a life with hate and malice. It's not really applied to wars. It's not applied as much to situations where there was an accidental killing. There were certain avenues that people could go down if that happened. But the commandment itself is talking about what we would call first degree murder, and there were manslaughter and second degree murder. Those were actually part of the biblical code as well. But for this one, it says we don't need to kill people because we get angry with them, and that makes sense at the most basic level. So for people who killed someone accidentally or for other reasons, there were cities of refuge that allowed, and there were avenues of grace for deaths that were not murder. And so these were places that people could go. They were places of safety. It got them out of perhaps angry family members and others who might want to hurt them, and put them in a place where they would be safe. But it didn't allow for them to experience the punishment that would have gone for killing another person. Now, Hosea and some of the Old Testament prophets said that oppression of the poor and powerless or vulnerable is a kind of murder. It's a way of killing people slowly, one step at a time. And Jesus indicates that our words can murder, that we can use our words in such a harmful and hateful way that they become murderous as well. And so killing strictly by the Ten Commandments, by what we find there in Exodus, is first degree murder, but we're also reminded throughout Scripture that there are slower and more sneaky ways to kill people that can have just as much harm. The seventh commandment is pretty straightforward. Don't commit adultery. Adultery is considered the highest category of sexual sin. Now, the Old Testament deals with a lot of different sexual sins, and who you can and can't have sex with, and animals and everything else. There's a law for it somewhere. But when it comes to categories, adultery was the highest, and the reason is that it was a violation of family and the covenant. It was a violation of trust. And when that trust was broken, it wasn't just that sexuality was a sinful issue, but it affected so many other people, and still adultery affects so many other people and can destroy the family structure and unit itself. And so it is one of the commandments because of its destructiveness to the family unit. If you remember the story of Abimelech and Abraham and Sarah, Abram was trying to not get killed, and this was a foreign king, and so he sort of offers Sarah to be his wife or concubine, and which a lot of ethical questions were going to Abraham about why he would do that. But what was fascinating was Abimelech's response was one of horror. He realized that he was taking on someone else's wife, and that was a higher level of sin than simply to have sexual relationship outside of a marriage relationship. And so Abimelech was horrified that Abram would suggest such a thing. The word adultery comes from the word adulterate, and it means to mix a foreign ingredient into something. If you adulterate a chemical formula by putting in something that doesn't belong, that word it comes from the same root, has really a similar meaning, that there's a foreign ingredient added into a marriage that is going to be destructive to it. It's going to make the chemistry wrong. and so it is to be avoided. Fidelity prevents many emotional, disease, and financial struggles for families. And early in the life of Israel, it was realized that it was so important that that relationship be kept in trust and to not be forgotten. Our next commandment is number 8, and that deals with stealing. Uh, don't steal. There's a lot of questions. Could gambling be a form of stealing, or is kidnapping or forcing a person into slavery? In the Old Testament view, that was a form of stealing. We probably wouldn't think of it that way today, but in Scripture, it's considered a part of that. We have to not take what's ours. That seems very simple. You look at Malachi, he reminds us that holding our tithes back from God is also a form of stealing. And so we have to be careful to not steal from God as well. The 9th commandment deals with lying. And we don't need to bear a false witness. We need to tell the truth. We live in a world that struggles with what even is the truth, and there are versions of truth. The Scripture and the commandments remind us that we have a much deeper responsibility to be persons who are of truth. In our culture today, especially, I think we as Christians have an opportunity to live out what God intended for culture, and that is to be a person who, with grace, tells the truth and can be believed. There's a book that I read once called The Speed of Trust, and it was written really for the business community. It was a reminder of why it is that certain businesses are able to partner with other businesses and get so much done. And the reality is, if you are a business owner, you want partners to trust with. They may not have the cheapest price, but you know that they're going to give you a fair price and that you can rely upon them. And so once trust leaves a relationship, once trust leaves a business relationship, you're in a situation that it takes so much more work and due diligence to make sure that you're not being ripped off. And the point of the book is, if you really want an organization that runs effectively and runs without fear and gets things done quickly, that trust is the most important piece of that, and hiring people who can be trusted are part of that. That is what God is getting at. If you want to live in a society that can accomplish the most, trust is very important, and lying eliminates trust. Lying also involves gossip, abuse, idle rumors, slandering. All of those would be in the same category, really, as lying. And our last commandment, number 10, is to not covet. God created all things good. He wanted us to enjoy all of creation. But unhappy people crave the things that aren't theirs. And you can see it, you can watch them. They just keep wanting things that they can't get. They want someone else's spouse that they can't get. They want a car they can't afford, or a house they can't afford. And they begin to covet, and it leads to a never-ending unhappiness because they can't be grateful and live with joy with what they do have. Coveting is often the root of a violation of another commandment. Coveting leads to anger, which can lead to murder. It can lead to adultery. It can lead to theft. It can lead to lying. And so the 10th commandment is sort of it's sort of a trigger for many of the other commandments that we have to look at. Well, let's pause now and look at these questions and discuss these ideas together.